There are more teams in the college football playoff than there used to be. Well, that means more controversy as well. The first round of the college football playoff was full of blowouts, and in response to those blowouts came questions about whether some of those teams should have been in the playoff in the first place. Welcome into SEC Football Unfiltered, our podcast from the USA Today Network. I'm Blake Toppmeyer alongside John Adams. Hope you had a Merry Christmas. As you might be able to tell from my voice, caught a virus over Christmas, but we're powering ahead on the podcast today. Scratchy though my voice may be, and scratchy though those performances were by the underdogs in the first round of the playoffs. John, really 4 blowouts in round 1. I guess you could say Texas and Clemson was competitive into the second half in a way that the other games were not, but overall 4 lopsided games. So before we get into particulars, whether a certain team should have been in or not, I guess your general takeaway from what we saw in the first round and those lopsided score lines.
Yeah, I don't want to lump Clemson with the others. I give Clemson credit for fighting back. It got down early, and it didn't just go away. I thought all the other 3 games all could have been worse than they were. The final score, Ohio State beat Tennessee 42-17, but it was kind of taking its foot off the accelerator. I thought it could have probably scored 56 without a whole lot of problems. Penn State was pretty dominant, and then Notre Dame. In a way, I was surprised by how all of these games were so one-sided, and probably more so with Indiana. Perhaps because I haven't moved on from Notre Dame's loss to a mediocre MAC team early in the season, and Notre Dame is better. Certainly has gotten better. So I thought Indiana had a chance to win that game, and I couldn't have been more wrong. And I thought Tennessee had a chance to beat Ohio State. That was the worst beating of all was, Ohio State came out there, and Tennessee looked as though it didn't have a clue what Ohio State was doing offensively. Everything Ohio State did worked. A lot of credit to offensive coordinator Chip Kelly. He's an elite play caller. They had a great plan going in. Not so much credit to Tim Banks, who defense coordinator for Tennessee, who's up for the Broyles Award. Has that already been awarded?
I hope
hopefully
not.
Hopefully it was for him before the game.
Yeah, it's interesting with Ohio State. We can get into this more in a moment, but that was the game plan they needed against Michigan, right? Putting their playmakers in space. They have the best receiving core in the country, and it showed against Tennessee, and they leaned on that strength. They didn't do that so much against Michigan. Of course, the offensive line played better against Tennessee than it did against Michigan. Will Howard, the quarterback, played better. That was the Ohio State team that we expected to see this season, the team that we expected to be a front runner for the national championship. They looked the part in Columbus. And it was interesting, John, because up until that game, some of the mouthpieces for the SEC, now we would never be accused of being mouthpieces for the SEC, of course not. But yes, so in other corners, the mouthpieces for the SEC were ringing loud and clear after Indiana and SMU got blown out of, oh, the committee screwed this up. Those teams shouldn't have been into the playoff. You know, some more 9-3 teams from the SEC should have been in, whether that be Ole Miss, Alabama, South Carolina, and the blowouts proved it. Well, that chorus line went quiet after the final game of the first round, and Tennessee got embarrassed, even more so than Indiana and SMU did. My take on this, John, is that these blowouts don't prove that Indiana or Tennessee shouldn't have been in the playoff. What it proves is that the teams that blew them out are better teams, which is what we thought going into the playoff. That's why they were seated higher. And also, home field advantage is a distinct benefit in these playoff games. And I think that showed in the first round. Now, I think SMU, for me, is a little bit of a different story. I didn't think SMU should have been in this bracket after losing the ACC championship to Clemson. wasn't a hill I was going to die on because the other candidates for the playoff all had flaws in their resume as well. But yeah, I didn't think SMU should be in, and I didn't think they played like a playoff team against Penn State. But in the case of Indiana and Tennessee, I thought they had built a playoff resume. Indiana didn't play the strongest schedule, but they went 11-1. Tennessee 10-2 from the SEC. That's a playoff resume, and they just got skunked in the playoff by better teams. They were on the road, and that's that. I don't think, to me, it didn't mean that Indiana or Tennessee didn't belong in the playoff, but I'm curious what you thought. Were those games enough to show you that the committee screwed up in putting Indiana, Tennessee, or SMU in the playoff?
Yes, they did show me that. Indiana, I overrated Indiana all year, maybe because I watched Indiana dismantle Nebraska, which isn't a powerhouse. But maybe it's that old Nebraska. I've been around so long. I remember when Nebraska was a powerhouse and a dynasty. So just seeing that red and white with that N on the helmet makes me think it's better than they are. And when Indiana scored 56 on them, I thought, wow, they might be the real deal. The same against Ohio State. Yes, it looked as though it didn't belong. But at least Ohio State scored some special teams touchdowns. And so I thought, okay, a lot of teams maybe couldn't hang with Ohio State on Ohio State's best day. But then watching Indiana against Ohio State and looking at its schedule, it just didn't beat anybody in the top 25. And I think it's paramount that the committee pays more attention to strength of schedule. Now, I'm not saying with SMU. I didn't think SMU or Indiana belonged. I give Tennessee credit because it had a win over Alabama, and it's in the nation's toughest conference. I still believe that. However, I think other teams could have been more competitive in that game than Tennessee was. I think South Carolina could have been more competitive, and I think Ole Miss could have been more competitive. Ole Miss beat Georgia handily, and it also beat South Carolina handily. And it has a very talented roster. Ole Miss has a bigger upside than Tennessee does, and probably is more so than anybody in the SEC does, except for, well, it beat Georgia, so I can't say that even. It had an upside. It had down games. These teams can't complain about not being in the playoff. They don't need to be whining about not. They lost 3 games. That's more than enough chances. However, if you're looking for competitive playoff games, and if you're trying to project who could be more competitive, you might look at it a little differently.
Yeah, my problem with keeping Indiana out, John, at 11-1 based on their strength of schedule is you could play who did Texas beat during the regular season? Texas really didn't have much of a resume either. They were 10-2 and lost to Georgia twice, and their best win was against a Texas A&M team that wound up losing 4 games. So I think that's where, for me, you can get into some trouble. Excuse me, Texas was 11-2 because they played in the SEC championship. But be that as it may, lost to Georgia twice. Their best win was at Texas A&M, and for me, it's just a little bit tough to boot an 11-1 Indiana team out of the playoff that beat 8 of the 9 Big Ten teams that they faced. They don't control their conference schedule. They do control their non-conference schedule, and I think they should have scheduled a tougher non-conference game. However, they don't control their conference schedule. They beat 8 of the 9 Big Ten teams, and to me, you start to head down a slippery slope there when you kick out teams with an 11-1 record. Because, like I said, what's the argument for Texas at that point at 11-2 with their best win and really only signature win the entire season, I guess, was at Texas A&M, and then if you want to count at Michigan, but Indiana beat Michigan too. So that's the issue I have with keeping a team like Indiana out of the playoff in favor of, say, a 9-3 South Carolina, or a 9-3 Alabama that lost to Vanderbilt and Oklahoma. So let's run through it, John. I'm gonna ask you whether the committee should have put this team in, yes or no, and if no, who you would have put in instead of this team. So let's start with the 9 seed. Tennessee got skunked by Ohio State. In hindsight, yes or no, should the committee have put Tennessee in the playoff?
Yes, based on the win over Alabama, I guess you could do that.
Okay, so Tennessee's a yes, they should be in.
Yes.
How about the 10 seed, Indiana? I'm saying yes. I was getting some no vibes from you earlier. So yes or no, should Indiana have been in or not? And if not, who do you think they should have been replaced by?
Well, you make a valid point about the comparison to Texas. I look at Texas and I look at Indiana, and I think Texas is a better team.
So I agree. Yeah, I think they are a better team. I think if we go by strength of schedule, it's a little hard to
make I know. I guess I'm incorporating the eye test into my evaluation, which is very risky business. Mm-hmm. Because I thought Indiana passed the eye test when I watched it score 56 on Nebraska. But yeah, I would say I would put Indiana out and put South Carolina in because it won its last 6 games, and it just beat Clemson, which made the playoff, beat Clemson on its home field. I know it lost to Alabama and Ole Miss, but overall, I just think as a good team, I think I would have put it in.
Okay, so you have Indiana out, South Carolina in. I had SMU out. I was getting some out vibes from you earlier with SMU. Is that right? You'd have SMU out, and if so, who would you already got South Carolina in your field? Who would you swap in for SMU?
I would put Ole Miss in.
Yeah,
and again, that a lot of that is the eye test. I mean, you could make a case that Alabama beat Georgia, Ole Miss beat Georgia, Ole Miss beat it more handily, and Ole Miss has a bad loss. Alabama has a bad loss. Ole Miss has a worse loss to Kentucky. But in terms of being competitive, if I had to pick a team, if I watch that team play and I say, okay, who could have competed? Which team do I think might have beaten Penn State? I think Ole Miss could have beaten Penn State. I'm not sure Alabama could have. But if I would have bet on the Ole Miss Penn State game, I would have bet on Ole Miss that it could beat Penn State.
Yeah, I would have had Ole Miss in the playoff as well. I thought Tennessee and Indiana should be in, so we differed on Indiana. I would have had SMU out as you did, and I would have had Ole Miss in. I would not have put South Carolina in over Indiana. I actually would have seeded Ole Miss number 10 and had Indiana number 11, and that would have been my field there. I also think for all this squabbling over, well, should this team have been in or should have been that team? You hit it on the head earlier, John, and you could, you made the argument that 2 of those teams shouldn't have been in, Indiana and SMU, but you said it best. Like, if you lost 3 games, even if maybe you should have been in the field, you really don't have a great leg to stand on. You lost 3 games, right? You could have taken this out of the committee's hands and won it on the field, won your way in on the field. The other thing, John, I think with all this focus on whether Indiana or SMU or Tennessee should have been in or not, I think the biggest mistake the committee made, and I said this after the bracket came out, I think the biggest mistake was seeding Ohio State 8th. Almost at no point this season did Ohio State look like the 8th best team. For most of the year, they looked like a top 2 or 3 team. Even when they lost to Oregon by 1 point on the road, Ohio State looked pretty darn good in that game. For one game against Michigan, they stunk and they lost. They also struggled against Nebraska, but they won that game. And for most of the season, I thought Ohio State looked pretty darn good, but I thought the committee became a victim of the moment and seeded them overly harsh because of that loss to Michigan right at the end of the schedule, and totally forgot that they beat Penn State during the regular season. Penn State was seeded 2 spots ahead of Ohio State when Ohio State beat them on the road in early November. And so I thought that was the biggest flaw the committee made Not so much who was in and who was out, but the seeding. And now, Oregon, here's your prize, Oregon, for being undefeated, number one in the nation, is, you might be playing the second best team in the country. You're an underdog, actually, against Ohio State. That's what the sports books think of Ohio State after that round one dominating win against Tennessee. Really, I think Ohio State should have been seeded fifth, sixth at worst. And that was the biggest flub by the committee, because now they've made Oregon play Ohio State a second time. And in the quarterfinals, it's not like they're having to play them a second time in the championship or the semifinals. They have to play them in the quarterfinals. And I think Ohio State is one of the two best teams in the country. I was still kind of thinking that coming into the playoff. I definitely think that after they smashed Tennessee, and I thought they were woefully underseeded just based on the fact that they lost to Michigan.
Yeah, that's something you have to be really careful about. The Ohio State-Michigan game is a big game every year. A lot of people watch that game, even if they have no rooting interest in it. It's, the personification of college football rivalries. I just thought the committee did place too much import on that game. Yeah, Michigan won. And yes, Ohio State looked really lame. It had a poorly conceived game plan. I don't quite understand what it was trying to do against Michigan. It was as though it wanted to play to Michigan's strengths and show that it could beat Michigan in its own game, which it couldn't. But I think if those teams played again, if they played best 2 out of 3, I think Ohio State would win. But Ohio State had a really good loss to Oregon. It almost won that game. And that's the number one team, the unbeaten team, and it almost won the game on the road. And then the win over Penn State, again, on the road. I put a lot of stock in road wins. So, yes, Ohio State wasn't seeded well. With all these different people in a room making these decisions, it seems like somebody would say, hey, wait a minute. Wait a minute here. I know Ohio State just lost a close game to Michigan, but it is a rivalry game. And we've seen really good Alabama national championship teams almost lose to mediocre Auburn teams. That's what happens in these biggest rivalries. Those are, to me, the two biggest rivalries in college football. So somebody, to me, should have raised that question. And you got to look at the body of work. And having beaten Penn State and barely lost to the number one seed warranted Ohio State being seeded higher.
Yeah, and they crushed Indiana too, regardless of whether you think Indiana should be a playoff team or not. They were the only team that beat Indiana in the regular season. Ohio State joined Oregon and Georgia as the only teams coming into the playoff that had beaten multiple playoff qualifiers. Georgia had the most wins over playoff teams, followed by Oregon. And then Ohio State had 2 wins over playoff qualifiers. Those are the only 3 teams, Oregon, Georgia, and Ohio State, that had multiple wins against playoff qualifiers. The committee ignored that and seeded them 8th when they should have been a couple spots higher. And so now, John, Georgia lurks on the opposite side of the bracket. We'll get a better read on Gunnar Stockton in this Sugar Bowl game against Notre Dame. If Gunnar Stockton's up for the challenge, I think Georgia wins. If he's not, Notre Dame's a hot team and they can win. Texas still in the bracket. Texas looked great against Clemson. We've thought Texas looks good on the eye test all season. I'm not ready to rule them out either. However, if forced to choose who the national champions are going to be at this point, John, I think I would go with the winner of Oregon, Ohio State in the Rose Bowl. I think that'll be a really good game. I think Texas can win the national championship. I think Georgia can win the national championship. Notre Dame and Penn State, I don't rule them out. Maybe a little bit more of a long shot, but I don't rule either of those teams out. So I think 6 of the 8 teams in the bracket that are left can win the whole thing. But picking a favorite, I would take the winner of the Rose Bowl as my favorite. How about you?
Yeah, I agree. Texas looked really good at times. It looked really good against Clemson. It probably has a roster comparable to Ohio State's, pretty close. I would still say Ohio State has the most talented roster. One thing, though, with Georgia that sticks out to me is don't underestimate them. I
Yep.
think Kirby Smart is a preeminent coach in college football. And the fact that he beat Texas not once but twice, and neither game was at Sanford Stadium. It was in Austin and in the SEC title game, which you could say was pretty heavily filled with Bulldogs fans. But Kirby Smart is really good at this, and I know the quarterback thing. I put great emphasis on quarterback play, so that should make you go into the Notre Dame Georgia game, and it looks like Notre Dame has a quarterback advantage. How can you? Riley Leonard is he's not as an elite passer, I wouldn't say, but he's a solid passer and he's a really good runner. We just don't know about Gunnar Stockton, but he looked really good in that second half. Now that the team has had time to game plan for him, maybe he won't look as good. And Notre Dame has a pretty fierce defense. So, but I agree with you. Bottom line, that Ohio State-Oregon game, you would think the winner that should be the favorite, certainly.
John, before we get to our picks, I want to wrap up with Ohio State, Oregon, and I know those aren't SEC teams, but they affect whether SEC teams make the playoff. And one of the biggest storylines of this playoff is Ryan Day at Ohio State. What's going to happen to him if he doesn't win the national championship? Like Ohio State fans, you saw it in the crowd in that first round game against Tennessee. I mean, there were probably 30,000 Vols fans in the stands that night at the Horseshoe buying up those tickets from Ohio State fans that didn't want to go to that game. They're fed up with Ryan Day after his fourth straight loss to Michigan. But here he is in the playoff quarterfinal with a team very capable of winning the national championship. Do you think it should be national title or bust for Ryan Day? Like, does Ohio State need to move on from him if he doesn't win the whole thing? I mean, he'd be due a buyout in excess of $30 million. His record is phenomenal against everybody except Michigan. But he hasn't won a national championship. He got there once, but lost the national championship game. He dominates Penn State. He dominates really everybody in the Big Ten other than Michigan. He's got a super squad. The fans seem fed up with him. What does Ohio State do with Ryan Day if he doesn't win the whole thing? Do they say, fans, calm down, this is our guy, he's won almost 90% of his games here, and we think he's going to finally beat Michigan next year? Or do you think you got to listen to the crowd that showed up in the first round of that playoff game and make a move on from Ryan Day if he doesn't win the national title?
You don't have to listen to the crowd that didn't show up. But you do have to listen to your NIL support team. They fund your program now. That's the world in which we live in college football. So you can't dismiss that. If those people say, I've had it with Ryan Day, I'm not giving you one more cent if Ryan Day's a coach, that's when you have to really think about this. Yeah, on the surface, it's hard to fathom you getting rid of a coach who's won, 88% of his games or whatever. Tremendous record. However, you're trying to win a national championship. And if you think he can't do it, and your boosters, your affluent boosters who are funding NIL programs, if they don't think he can do it, then you got to take a long, hard look at this. Whom would you hire, though? That's the question. Sometimes there's a guy out there that you can say, do they want to bring Urban?
Mike Vrabel is the white whale for Ohio State. Former Tennessee Titans coach, Ohio State alum. He's working some low-level job in the NFL right now, waiting for his next head coaching job. That's Ohio State fans' white whale at this point is Mike Vrabel.
Well, my white whale would be Urban Meyer.
Just bring her back.
That's guaranteed championship. You could bring him back. But I don't think he's coming back. I don't think he thinks it's in his best interest of his health to come back. But here's one thing about Ryan Day. He has two really good coordinators. I would think about that And before I made a change, I would think long and hard about that. Chip Kelly was great in that Tennessee game. Now I don't know what
Yes.
happened in Michigan. I don't know what happened at Michigan. Was that a Ryan Day call or Chip Kelly call? Jim Knowles a good defensive coordinator, so I think that's a factor to consider. But I think at the end of the day, it comes down to the people that fund the NIL program.
Yeah, I
But
think that's a fair point, Johnny. If the boosters have moved on from him, then maybe it is time to move on. If they haven't moved on, and it's just some fans that didn't want to pay to show up in a 25-degree playoff game, well, maybe they'll want to show up next September with a fresh slate and a fresh shot at things. That I think that's a fair point. You listen to your NIL dollars and let that influence the choice. All right, John, let's pick these quarterfinal games. In the first round, I went 3-1. You went 2-2. So I have now opened up a 1-game lead over you in the race for mediocrity in our pick'em contest. I am 41-45 against the spread. You are 40-46. So if we win out, John, we can finish above 500. It's possible, mathematically possible.
That's mathematically possible, but highly unlikely. I do a very poor job on bowl picks historically, and I'm proving that again this season.
All right, well, here we go. Penn State, a 10.5-point favorite over Boise State, the better seeded team because of the funny way we seed teams in this playoff bracket. Boise State, the 3 seed, but Penn State is a 10.5-point favorite. This is one where I'm going to take the underdog and the points, John. Maybe the Boise State Cinderella performances from yesteryear are still lingering in my brain, or maybe I'm just so impressed by Ashton Jeanty, who I voted number 1 for the Heisman, 1 spot ahead of Travis Hunter, who won the award. I think Penn State wins this game. If the spread was 9.5, I might take Penn State, but at 10.5, I am going to take those points, and I will take Boise, the underdog.
Well, bad news for you. I agree.
Ooh, that is bad news.
Yeah, well, I actually like Boise State's quarterback too. And Boise State, I think Boise State Penn State will get the very best version of Boise State. Boise State, it may not have the wherewithal to win the game, but I think it's going to keep fighting. And I don't see Boise State going away. If Penn State jumps out to a quick lead in Boise State, oh my gosh, we can't compete with the mighty Big Ten. We're done. I don't see that happening. I see it fighting back. I've watched Boise State a handful of times. I had Ashton Jeanty second behind Travis Hunter, but I thought he's had a great year. Those two guys were both, to me, very worthy Heisman Trophy winners. So I wouldn't have argued with either one. So, yeah, I like Boise State to cover in that game.
Yeah, and fair point about Boise quarterback Maddox Madsen. If Boise's going to win this game, they're going to need some production out of him. And Penn State's defense is really, really good. One of the best defenses in the country, and has showed it time and time again. Even in the loss to Ohio State, defense gave him a shot in that game. So as good as Ashton Jeanty is, you can't just expect him to run it down Penn State's throat for 4 quarters. So they will need their quarterback to deliver in that game. Okay, another lopsided spread, John, favoring the lower seeded team, making number 4 seed Arizona State a massive underdog. And this one, 13.5-point favorite is Texas. So who do you like in this one? You giving the points, or are you taking the points and taking the Sun Devils?
I think Sun Devils are underrated. So I will take the points. Texas it beat the spread against Clemson, I guess, or hit it pretty much right on the head. I think the final spread might have gone up to 14.
They covered the spread based on our lines, but yeah,
on
I'm
our
not
lines,
sure. Yeah, what it was at kickoff.
Yeah, I think Arizona State is underrated. So I'll go with the Sun Devils. That they can. I think they have, if Texas jumps out to big lead, I think Arizona State has enough offensive firepower that it can come back and score some points. Maybe Texas is up 20 points. I could see Arizona State driving for a touchdown in the last 2 minutes. So I'll take Arizona State.
Yeah, my concern with Arizona State, John, is Cam Scatabo is such an engine for that offense, and you know how much I like this Texas defensive front, that defensive line. It's pretty darn good, and so I wonder how much success Scatabo will have. He's had a lot of success this season. Was considered by many for their Heisman ballots. I considered him for my number 3 spot. He looked great in the Big 12 championship game, but I think going up against Ohio State, going up against Texas will be much different. And as you know, John, I haven't been able to resist Texas much this season. I keep liking the Longhorns on the eye test, so I'm going to give the 13.5 points and say Texas wins by 14 or more. So that leaves us with the 2 most intriguing games that we've had so far in this playoff, I think. Let's start with the Rose Bowl. The aforementioned Ohio State, who looked so good in that first round, looked up to their national championship billing, so much so that the sports books have them as a 2.5-point favorite in Pasadena against undefeated and number 1 Oregon, which beat them by a single point in Eugene earlier this season. Interestingly, John, we remember the final play of that game where Will Howard, Ohio State's quarterback, slid just a moment or two too late as time expired, unable to get the timeout, and a long field goal attempt for Ohio State that could have won that game if successful. That's what we remember, I think, most from that game. But that was Will Howard's best game of the season. He was really good in that game. He threw for almost 330 yards. His season-high passing performance, I guess, at the very least, that was his best game up until he shredded Tennessee in the first round of the playoff. Those were his 2 best games of the season. So I think that's an encouraging sign, encouraging that Chip Kelly and Ryan Day leaned into their passing game. The strength of this team are those wide receivers. So maybe they found something there. And, even though that last play, Will Howard should have slid a couple steps earlier, for the most part, he was pretty good in that game. And so I'm not scared by that line. I'm going to give the 2.5 points and take the Buckeyes, influenced by that performance that I just saw them have against Tennessee.
I really like Dan Lanning as a coach, and I really like Dylan Gabriel as a quarterback. However, having watched that Ohio State dismantling of Tennessee, I just can't. I just think Ohio State now has some momentum going, and its offensive line played better than I thought it would, much better than I thought it would against Tennessee. I expect Oregon will have a better defensive game plan, but I just can't go against Ohio State at this stage right now. So I'd go with Ohio State too.
That leaves us with the Sugar Bowl, where Gunnar Stockton, the multi-year backup former blue chip recruit, will take the reins of the offense for the injured Carson Beck. Carson Beck out, not going to return, suffered an elbow injury in the SEC championship. Interestingly, Georgia was losing in that game to Texas when Carson Beck went out with an injury. Gunnar Stockton rallied them to an overtime victory. It wasn't all Gunnar Stockton. After Beck's injury, it forced Georgia to really commit to its ground game. Trevor Etienne had one of his best games of the season. Etienne missed 3 games in November with a rib injury, but he was back playing what appeared to be full strength in that SEC championship game. Stockton, more of a dual threat quarterback than what Carson Beck is. Beck is the guy that Georgia likes to stretch the field with. Might have to play a bit of a different game plan with Stockton. But Georgia, even with the quarterback change, a 1.5-point favorite. And I'm going to give the points and say backup Gunnar Stockton gets it done. And maybe more to the point, Georgia wins this one at the line of scrimmage. I really like Notre Dame at the line of scrimmage as well, John, but I think Georgia is up to the challenge in the trenches. And I think Georgia overall probably has a little bit more talent at the skill positions. This is not Georgia's best team at the skill positions by any stretch, But I do think, as compared to Notre Dame, they might have a little bit more there, and I think they are just as good along the lines of scrimmage. And I'm not turned off by Georgia having to play a backup quarterback, because I like what Gunnar Stockton brings with his legs, and I like that this is going to force Mike Bobo to lean on Trevor Etienne, which I think is his best offensive weapon that Georgia got away from, to their detriment at certain times this season.
I think when Trevor Etienne went out with an injury, people underestimated his value and how much he meant to Georgia. Kirby's smart. He's won championships throwing the ball, but he believes in a running game, and having Etienne back really makes a difference. These teams are very similar, I think, in what they want to do offensively. It's hard for me to think a team can beat Georgia at its game. You talk about winning in the trenches, where Notre Dame is strong as well. Well, so is Texas.
Yes.
Both sides of the ball, offensive and defensive line. And Georgia was still able to win those games. So I think this could be a low-scoring game, but I still like Georgia. And I'll really date myself on this one. I was covering the game in the Sugar Bowl in the Louisiana Superdome when Georgia beat Notre Dame with Herschel Walker after the 1980 season for the national championship. It was a one game. Whoever won that game was one of those weird deals where the two best teams actually ended up playing one another in a bowl, and Georgia won the game and got the vote. So I'll go back to that.
All right. Well, we are expecting maybe a couple good games finally in this quarterfinal round of the playoff after some blowouts in round one. But one way or the other, John and I will be back with you next week to discuss ahead of the semifinals. I hope you had a Merry Christmas. Have a Happy New Year. Enjoy the quarterfinal action. And check us out next week. We'll be back with you on SEC Football Unfiltered.